Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Brooke, it's our first episode back.
Season 3.
I'm so excited.
Me too.
So today on the podcast, we have two amazing guests that are here to help us kick off season 3 and teach us and everybody else a little bit about the really horrifying and interesting situation that's happening in Iran right now. And I'm so excited to learn from them.
I'm like overjoyed, I think is the term I want to use. These two women are badasses in their own right. So I can't really wait for them to A, introduce them, or B, get them talking, or C, just hang out with them for a little longer, or D, try not to act like a total idiot in front of them. So I have lots of goals for this podcast. But I'm just really excited to bring this topic to our audience. So
can't wait.
Yeah, let's get it started.
So, Brooke, we're back for season 3. We have a lot of exciting themes set up for the season. We are going to be diving much deeper than we did last season into feminist pedagogy and how to
here for it.
Do more inclusive learning, not just in the content that you're bringing into your classes, but also in the way that you're teaching, so that not only girls, but all students feel like they have space and opportunity to learn in that environment. So I'm really excited to sort of add those layers to the content that we're sharing with everybody.
Yeah.
But I think I'm itching, and I think you're itching to dive into the topic of today's episode, which is talking about the situation in Iran. And we have two guests with us, and I think maybe briefly we'll turn to them and have them introduce themselves. First, we have Dr. Shahla Haeri. She was on our podcast all last spring.
Yes, she's an alumni of the podcast.
She is an alumni. I think there should be, she wins the award, actually.
Yeah.
She's a 4-timer.
Woohoo! 4 times. I think people are going to want your autograph. You're part of the podcast team now.
Would you mind just introducing yourself to our audience?
It's lovely to be on this podcast again. My name is Shahla Haeri. I'm a professor of anthropology at Boston University.
Thank you again. And I'm really excited because this time I got to bring one of my colleagues at Plymouth State University in. Dr. Filiz Ruhm is the chair of the political science department, and I am so excited to have her here. This is her inaugural episode with us, so this is a big deal.
I am so excited to join the group, inshallah, to alumni of this podcast. Definitely. And I am looking forward to coming back again.
It's lovely to meet you.
Good.
I am very pleased to meet you, too.
Well, we are here, unfortunately, despite all the cheers, to talk about something that's pretty challenging to talk about. And I think it's something that people are seeing all over the media, and I think a lot of American teachers may not be as familiar with Middle Eastern politics, with the history of Iran, with some of the really interesting dynamics that are playing out in this situation. So for anybody who hasn't been near society anytime recently, a woman named Mahsa Amini, which is her Iranian name. She's a Kurdish woman, Sunni woman living in Iran. In Iran, they have a police force that provides guidance to women in their behavior.
I think you're trying to put air quotes around guidance, right?
Yes,
yeah, okay.
Yes, guidance, air quotes, all the things. 2 women in how they dress. They are like a morality police, and she was taken into custody because her hijab, which is like a headscarf, was too loose. And while in police custody, she died. And the official report says that she died of a heart attack, but her family is unconvinced. They believe that she was brutalized and hurt while in prison, and that she was killed by the police because of this sort of corrupt power structure that's created by this morality police, whatever.
And this isn't an uncommon story either. This is something that happens really frequently, and this is one of the first times that we, I think in America, have really heard about these circumstances. Is that right?
Well, it's not necessarily the first time that it's blown up, but it feels, at least for recent memory, like a very big deal. And so, you know, and there's a lot of dynamics here. Iran is a primarily Shia country, where majority of the Muslims that are living there, Shia in a global sense, are a minority among Islam, but there's a huge congregation in Iran where they're a majority. And this, you know, this young woman, in addition to just being a woman with a loose headscarf, is, you know, from the Kurdish minority. She's Sunni, living in Iran, and I think it erupted so much in the Muslim world, as well as you know, abroad and in the West, where we are,
One like the global feminist community.
Because you know, because there's so many layers there, right? There's a lot of things to talk about. So I think, you know, what's exciting here about our two guests, Shahla Haeri is a historian and an anthropologist, and she can give us a lot of the context. She also is from Iran originally in her life, and so she can give us some great details about the things that for us it's like, whoa, this is new information, and I think
Yes.
for a lot of people it's like, no, that's not new information. This has been happening for a long time. So I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Shahla, to tell us more about this history.
Yeah.
I would be happy to. I'm just going to make it quick, but just to give a brief historical background to the issue of veiling in Iran and the women's participation or women's desires to be part of the larger society and be given a voice and be visible or active in political domain. The first event that we can talk about is at the turn of the century, and that is the Constitutional Revolution of 1905. And this is an amazing, really, revolution that happened in Iran, and the demand was for democracy, and of course, women were part of it, and they participated in some of the demonstrations, some of the discussions, activities, institutions. But ultimately, the constitution that was written at the time, due to the influence that the clerics exerted, women were not given any rights.
That means the right to vote or to participate in the election.
To vote, or the rights to hold any offices, or to you know, be a more active, useful, helpful member of the community that they wanted. Of course, women went ahead. They established, you know, schools for girls, which again, you know, confronted some kind of oppositions by the clerics. And I won't go into that, but I just want to focus on the idea of the veil. And the modernity and democracy and the freedom and the women's demands to be part of the civil society. By 1936, the first Pahlavi Shah, Reza Shah, who came to power in the aftermath of a coup d'etat, as part of his modernization projects and programs, and of course following the Ataturk in Turkey, made an order that women have to take off their veils when they appear in public. Now, this was enforced. This was, the women had no options. In other words, again, it was an imposition on them. Women and their families who have always gone out, you know, being a bit covered or, you know, used to having that kind of veil around them, you know, so they just they couldn't venture outside, and if they did, their veils would be ripped off from their heads. So women were confronted with violence, but the objective of the state was to create a modern society. As some symbols of modernity, women's body became the site on which they just wrote this whole idea of, all right, you know, we take off her veil, we put a hat on her head, and then let her loose in society. And of course, I have to say that there were some, because of industrialization, women were actually observed in some factories.
So what dates are those? Because Ataturk is
So the
1936.
first one was
Okay.
1906, the Constitutional Revolution, which, by the way, now that we're at it, the Qajar king still, it was under the monarchy of the previous dynasty. They actually, finally in 1911, they were able to completely overwrite the constitution. In other words, even though the constitution nominally existed, but nobody really followed the rules and regulations in the constitutions. Again, there were some autocrats, and there were all these, the royal court and the dynasty, the Qajar dynasty, was very powerful until the coup d'etat of Reza Shah in 1923, I believe, must have been, because the date might be 1921, 22. I'm not exactly certain about the exact date of the coup d'etat. And then he came to power, and then he abolished the former monarchy and established the Pahlavi monarchy, right? So by 1936, he felt powerful enough. In fact, he set out to do a lot of modernization, try to create a modern army, a judiciary, schools, birth certificates for everyone. So there was a lot of activities that were in line with a more modern society. In other words, trying to push Iran from what, this traditional and rather backward, shall we say, society more into a modern state. And for that, he thought that women should be, unveiled. An interesting thing is that he himself was quite concerned, because he really didn't want his own wife or wives and mother or daughters to appear unveiled in public. But eventually he came around accepting that. So he walked out of the palace with his daughters, with his wives, and all the women within his household. This was 1936. But the point I want to make is that to take off the veil from women's heads involved violence.
Is there was there a reasoning at the time of, you're talking about modernization, but tell me a little bit more about that. So what was the motive to taking the veils off? Was it to make progress? Was it to change the opinion of the female? Like, what was the thesis behind the motive to do that? Because
in a global sense, this is post World War I, and even right on the precipice of II. And the Ottoman Empire has crumbled as a result of that. And I think all nations during World War I, this is a war of attrition, they have to mobilize the entire population in order to
survive.
Battle that.
Yeah.
So women here in the States, abroad in Europe, in the Middle East, wherever this war touched, were mobilized to work in factories and things like that. So they're trying to pull these women out. And I'm so glad you made this parallel to Turkey, because I think it's a really important parallel. And I wanted to share with our teachers that the Stanford History Education Group has an outstanding little mini inquiry lesson plan that you could use about Ataturk's reforms in Iran. In Turkey. And I guess I didn't realize, and I'm so glad you shared with me the connection that this is also sort of playing out in Iran.
Absolutely, it did. Ataturk became an object of admiration by Reza Shah. He was powerful, he was well liked, he was trying to modernize his society. Of course, what Ataturk did, and Reza Shah didn't do that, and I think that was for the better, is that he didn't change the script. But then, of course, many other good things that Ataturk did in Turkey, the Shah in Iran was not able to do it or did not want to do it.
So Filiz is actually from Turkey originally in life. And so I feel like this is a great transition to having you sort of chime in.
I think when we look at that time, although we are talking about this two incredible civilizations, cultures, and the deep roots in the history, but we are also looking at that time period as nation creation. Yeah. Both in Iran and Turkey, and in some way, brand new. Correct me, Shahla, if I am wrong. And Reza Shah changed the name from Persia to Iran and Aryan, and in 1934 actually. And Turkey, when Turkish Republic got created in 1923, and both countries or the leaders of those countries chose to turn their face to West.
Exactly.
Modernization, Westernization, and that ideological battle to a certain extent happened over women's bodies and attires. And Turkey went through the similar process and banning veil in public places as well. But as Shahla was saying, and Atatürk also did this incredible reforms and empowered the women because Turkey was one of the first countries giving suffrage, the right to vote to women, local elections in 1930. And overall 1934. Think about it. Switzerland got it in 1971. And to a certain extent, Reza Shah was imitating and admiring or competing, whichever way you want to put it.
But at some point, these things go away, right? So these freedoms exist. There's a lot of Westernization. One could see that as progress. But I also want to come back to what Shahla was saying, which is also, it came about forcefully, right? Like a lot of Muslim women that I know want to veil and want to cover, and to be forced to Westernize seems kind of interesting. And at some point there's a backlash, right?
Absolutely. Anytime that anything is forced, imagine, abortion in this country, in the US, when it becomes when you have no choice, then it becomes a point of discontent. And eventually some people rise against it. But before I get into that, I want to just mention this interesting point that Filiz just made about Reza Shah changing the name. It actually he wasn't changing the name. Iran was always Iran, right? Except that foreigners who had gone to Iran and started addressing him, but particularly started with the Greeks, who started referring to Iranians as the Persians by their local name and the name of the dynasty. At that time was the Persians. So then, outside of Iran, it was always known as Persia, because inside the country, everybody knew.
Oh, interesting.
Invented a name.
He just told people, hey,
this is how we'd actually like to be known.
Time and making it official. There is some officially do it in 1934, at least my knowledge, and maybe the name change are making the name clear. And to a certain extent, for both Atatürk and Reza Shah, and cutting ties with the old and taking a step closer to the West, and because at least for Atatürk, and cutting ties with the Ottomans and the baggage was important.
They were rebranding. They were rebranding the whole country. And so this was the first time that someone had addressed the veil in politics at this period and said, okay, this is where we're going. How did it get to the next phase where it was more severe and people are wearing it?
That's what I was going to come to, looking at it again historically. By 1941, when Reza Shah was abdicated by the Allied forces and his son came to power, he just, let people choose what they wanted to do. So I had my grandmother who was veiled, and my grandfather's an Ayatollah, and his daughters and grandchildren and all that, nobody put up the veil, right? So we could have people walking side by side in the streets of Tehran, people wearing the veil, the long chador, not the scarf, primarily the chador, and wasn't the black that is now the basically the enforced form of veiling in Iran, long veil. So they could just wear. So it became a matter of choice, right? Until 1979. So from 1941 till so for 5 years, it was forced, violently women were obliged to take off their veils or just at least appear in public without their veils. But from 1941 till 1979, people could dress as they pleased.
I'll just pause you there. That's a huge chunk of time. and multiple generations that have grown up now that are still alive today that remember this time period. So these are individuals that are in the world today of the generations are the parents or grandparents of the current 20 somethings, 30 somethings that are in the community today. So what changed in 1978? 1979.
People have this historical memory, and because as I mentioned, people just like myself, I was born before the revolution in Iran. So by 1979, it was a revolution. It was a popular revolution, not an Islamic revolution. That's when, after the revolution and with the hostage crisis, then the religious factions, the clerics, were able to consolidate power. And of course, it was the charisma of Ayatollah Khomeini that brought everyone together, that coalesced all these different factions under his umbrella. So the religious faction became very popular. But for him, he always hated the Shah and Reza Shah. So for him, the greatest achievement, in fact, that's what more or less what he says, the greatest achievement of the establishment of Islamic Republic was to reimpose.
And so
the greatest achievement is to control women. Got it.
Again, that's what I was going to draw the parallel. The first time it was the woman's body that was controlled, that was presumably symbolic representations of modernity. The second time, again, you manipulate women's bodies as an object and put a veil on that to have her to represent as an Islamic modesty. Both times, you have this violence against women's bodies and minds and agencies in trying to, force them to do something that they really don't want to do it. And what's interesting, we should note here that initially, in Iran, because immediately after the establishment of Islamic Republic, we had the war with Iraq. So there was this imposition of this horrible war of 8 years. So many people just held their tongue and, they just went along with the rules and regulations. And in fact, many women owned the veil and appeared in public in drove. In the 80s, if you had gone to Iran, there were more women in the service sections of the economy than there were men. So, but by owning the veil, in fact, they became more visible. They became more active. So at that time, the veil functioned as a different function different.
I really like these parallels you're making because I feel like most teachers talk about these events that you're discussing. Especially like if you teach U.S. history, you talk about the Iranian hostage crisis,
right,
and the overthrow of the U.S. embassy in Tehran, and you talk about, I hope that people, when they teach about the war in Iraq, go back far enough to talk about these events, because you can't really understand the 2003 war in Iraq if you don't understand the U.S. involvement in the wars you're talking about between Iran and Iraq. And you have to go back that far, I think, to really grasp it. So there's a lot of parallels here. And I really like this layer that you're adding to it, which is seeing these shifts in political power as also shifts in control over women, right?
Yeah.
And having these like really direct impacts on women's lives. Filiz, you look like you are itching to jump in here. So
in both cases, as Shahla was saying, women resisted, and in the second one, Iran-Iraq war provided the perfect opportunity for Iranian regime saying, okay, now they can execute it the way they wanted to. And if you resist, it doesn't matter why you are resisting. You are a threat to national security. We need to unite right now. So Iranian regime used that war perfectly to suppress women's resistance to forced veil this time around.
Very good point. And as I said, they put up with it because, as you said, for national security, national unity, okay, at some point they said, we'll just go along with it. Many resisted it, many didn't like it. Many tried to, play with the way they wore the scarves, even at that time. So there wasn't a unanimous response from the women. It's always complex. It's always diverse. And we have to understand many women do want to wear the veil.
You mean women didn't think all the same? They all didn't have one brain? You think all women weren't the same at that time? They just all didn't agree on it? Like, that's the thing that Kelsie and I draw to a lot, is that we're trying to diversify the opinions that we present in different places in history, that it's not just one woman's experience that we just assume was all women's experience. And so I imagine both of you pull from resources in your classroom to show the diversity of women and of people of different time periods to really display this. But, this is a really remedial example of it. But think about when Americans were asked to wear masks for a pandemic and how differently people responded to that. And that is all genders. That is that's a national ask by your government to do this one thing. And think how outraged.
It's not even stereotypical.
It's not.
Like we're going to target this gender.
Yeah, it wasn't trying to oppress any one group. It was like just blanket, let's do the right thing. And how vividly and ferociously people fought against it. Now take away half of that and it's just women and you're asking them to do this one thing. You could see, and now you can feel that parallel really deeply of like why this would be such a challenge for individuals for many years who didn't have to do this and weren't asked of this in their nation.
And to point out the difference, it's not medical necessity, right?
Right. Yeah. There was no like, hey, it's medically been proven that wearing a scarf on your head keeps you warmer. It's like, okay, great. Yeah. Like, let me put that on.
It is also time to emphasize this movement led by young people and women. It is not against Islam.
Right.
So I think we need to make it clear. It is, yes, among those people, there are secular believers too, and there are very devout Muslims too. The resistances to that imposition and trying to control women's bodies, women's autonomy. And that's why from all around the Middle East and the world, women from all walks of life, and from atheists to very devout Muslims, joining them, showing support. So it's really important to emphasize that this is not an anti-Islamic movement.
I mean, there are two places in the Quran where there are some references to the veil. One is in relations to Prophet Muhammad's wives, and basically doesn't say wear the veil. It says stay in your home, stay secluded, don't come out. And that's because of the political situation at the time when, his household was becoming too crowded, too many women were there, too many people were going there to besiege Prophet Muhammad. And of course, he had become such a beloved leader. Then another ayah refers to the veil, and that says, tell women, believing women, that when they leave home to pull their garments over their bosoms. And doesn't use the word veil. Hijab has never been used in the Quran in reference to women. So it's as a way of respect, not as a way of punishing women. Even nowhere in the Quran says if women don't wear the veil, which of course is not there, that they should be punished.
Yeah, and actually I've seen examples from, throughout the Middle Ages and into early modern history of women in the West actually veiling maybe even more than Muslim women. So like it's more of just like a norm in those geographic
Islamic, and you see it everybody as well. And as Shahla was mentioning, it is for women, it's about respect, and it is also very much used by upper class.
Yeah, I might be wrong, but someone had shared this with me in a writing course when I was in college, who wore a hijab, and someone had asked her a question about wearing it, and she made this comment and said, I actually feel bad for American women. And I said, oh, this will be interesting. She goes, you're objectified all the time for your bodies, for the way that you look, what you wear, how you present. That is not me or my culture, and I don't have to feel that pressure because I am honored for my mind and how I present, because this is how I choose to dress, and it's more respectable. And it was like, had never heard that thought process before.
That's very good. That's your choice and her choice.
Exactly.
As long as it is her choice to wear the veil, it's respected.
Exactly.
It's respected. It ought to be respected. Nobody should rip off the veil from her head. But by the same token, if I don't want to wear the veil, if another woman doesn't want to wear, they can't just come and say, no, you have to do it because men cannot control themselves. I always say in my classes that to force women to wear the veil is an imposition. It's an indignity on the part of the women, but it's an insult to men. Like the peasant women, the tribal women, they don't wear the scarf. I mean, they wear the scarf, not the veil, the way that it's now imposed on women.
The issues that discuss the imposition is the problem, and as long as it is women's choice, but as we have been talking about, especially when Shahla gave the history of it, and actually this symbol veil turning to a symbol is by imposition of not to wear. When you impose that, you are also taking away a chunk of big portion of the population out of the education system.
Right.
When you say that they cannot go to school, women, if they want to cover and they believe in, and they say schools are public and you cannot wear that. Well, it's very problematic. And actually, when Shah did that, it took those conservative women out of the equation. And then actually, the Iranian regime imposed it, and women from those said, okay, now it is safe to come out. Go to school. And we are talking about 60% of Iranian university grads are women. But that, interestingly, became a problem for the regime. Among the graduates from the university, 60% of them are women. Because when those women came out, got educated, and they are not satisfied with the laws and system as is. And now they are quite Muslim, but they are participating.
Yeah, interesting. So bring us up. So we sort of, the last sort of timeline thing, we were in the 80s, but obviously we've got
higher education.
They are educated, they are motivated, they are Muslim, and they don't like the system they're graduating into. What has happened? I understand they sort of put aside maybe some protests through the war period, but obviously things have been brewing for a long time since the 80s for the explosion that we're seeing today. So have women been have there been other protests that exploded in the last decade or two that maybe we could refresh memories on?
Well, yes, they have. I mean, even again, to go back to the constitutional revolutions, women did have demonstrations there. And throughout, they participated, they demonstrated, they demanded. We get to 1953, when there was a CIA coup d'etat in Iran. Women demonstrated in the streets of Tehran. In 1979, women came to the streets in droves. And of course, they demanded freedom. Little did they know that there's a factionalism between the very religious ones and the very leftist one, and neither one of whom thought that women should, at this point, demand to be part of the, civil society and having the political demands. Then, we have throughout Islamic, I mean, just as, Ayatollah Khomeini ordered the women wear the veil, the huge number of women came to the streets of Tehran. And I never forget, I wasn't in Tehran, but I saw it on the screen. I mean, it's snowing, and these women are walking, and women with the hijab, with the black veil, and without the veil, and they're talking about freedom, their rights to freedom. So then that was another time. In 2009, the so-called Green Revolution, there was another demonstrations, and all throughout. So now this time with Mahsa, there was just the, what is the expression, the straw that broke the camel's back. No more. No more indignities. Because it wasn't just to tell women, wear your scarf and walk out. If you had a slight way of not really wearing your veil according to them properly, you would be dragged into these vans and thrown into the vans by force by this man, and they had some women, who just helped them take them to God knows where to do what who knows what, and then let them out. So then they just thought enough is enough.
And does it also, so obviously it's terror on these women, it's terrorizing them, but it also affects their family.
Many men and families participated in these demonstrations. So in that sense, Filiz is right, that it's no longer just the veil, but all the pent-up frustrations, all the angers, all the things that they did not have. The economy is in shambles, as you said. All these sanctions, all this animosity with the neighborhood, with America, with other countries. We need to live our lives. You only get one chance to live your life. So enough is enough. And what is important, as I said, men participated in that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is a lot of movements that we've talked about on this podcast and ones that we've read about throughout history, women are fighting and they're doing this on a lot of solo acts. It's a lot of just women, just female gender running and running and running. And it's typically when the male counterpart comes in and not necessarily fights for them, but bolsters them up and says, go, we're right behind you and we're done with this. And we will help get you where you need to go too, because change has to happen. And so that's what I'm noticing with this current situation is how many men and families, older generations, are getting in the fight. It's not just the 30-somethings. It's not just the 40-somethings or the 20-somethings that are usually the revolutionary spirit, but there's multiple generations that are now like, enough. We're done with this and we're all in it.
When she was captured by the morality police, they had no idea whether she was Kurdish or Sunni or whatever. Definitely her women identity was the target. But when the protesters has been going on, and as we were just talking about, men join and there are strikes going on, there are boycotts going on, workers are there, and people are asking about why are we killing our children? That's very emotional. That's very powerful. They are our children, they are saying. But then going back to Mahsa Amini, as we mentioned, she was Iranian. She definitely Iranian, no doubt about it. But she was Kurdish Iranian. And so her name, Kurdish name, was Jina, which means life. Sadly and ironically, I know. And when you listen her family's interviews, they are using both names. And when you listen the Kurds around the world, they are talking about, please, let's not dismiss that identity as well, because Kurds in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, they are suffering. They deal with poverty. They deal with discrimination, and in all those countries. And the other part of it is also they are emphasizing the slogan of this protest, women, life, freedom. And actually, it started by the Kurdish freedom movement. And connected to Turkey, interestingly. And in the first time, Kurdish women, and then joined by Turkish women in Turkey, March 8, 2006, were using that slogan in Kurdish, Jin Jiyan Azad, Jivan Azadi. So, and very much connected to insurgency, terrorists, however you define it, Kurdish Workers' Party. And so they are saying, of course, this slogan belongs to all women around the world. But
Everyone.
let's not dismiss that Kurdish contribution to it, our sacrifices that comes with that too. So they take a different stand a little bit. Of course, her name was Mahsa, partially because the family was not allowed to officially give her a Kurdish name. That was the struggle of many Kurds in Turkey for that.
Wow.
That's why the name Jina, there is a gender component, there is an ethnic component, there is a poverty component and religious component, and she being also Sunni too. So it's very, very multi.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that this is, in so many ways, this woman from a couple minority backgrounds within Iran, and, not only have lots of people within Iran, but around the world come to protest on her behalf and the behalf of everybody who's faced these sort of, indignities. But, we've seen people cutting their hair. We've seen them burning their hijabs. Men too, even like buzzing their heads, just getting rid of their hair. Like, if this is what you're after, it's gone, if you want to police that. As of today, about 14,000 Iranian people are in prison for protesting, and that includes children. And not that Mahsa was a child. She was 22 years old, but she's, I teach 22-year-olds. They're little people to me. And I think it's just really overwhelming to think 14,000, like in the recent protests we've had in the States, I don't think we've had that, like even close to that
I doubt
number
there's a
of people
comparison. But there's
in
also,
prison.
do we have a stat on how many people have also died after her as well? Because I feel like that.
350 official
that is
numbers,
wild.
and at least 41 of them are children.
The majority are
Yeah,
children.
it
They
is.
are very young people. And
Youth.
I want to come back to this slogan, which I think it's an amazing slogan. And perhaps that's why it has resonated so strongly across the borders, in the East, in the West, South, and North. Life, women, life, freedom. It's just amazing. And like in fact, it has preempted a lot of other slogans that had more a sense of masculinity in them. But this one has really a sense of life in it. Women are the life givers. And it's women, life, and then with that come freedom. That whole symbolic protest to cut one's hair. Of course, cutting hair, according to in the Iranian tradition, pre-Islamic tradition, was a sign of mourning, because hair is a woman's beauty, right? And that's one reason they want to cover that. So mothers whose young children would die, then they would cut their hairs. Lover whose beloved would die for whatever reason or get killed, they would cut the hair. But in this particular case, it wasn't just as a mourning sign for Mahsa and a lot of other young people, Nika and Sarina and all these beautiful young kids who killed. I mean, they were like 18, 17, 18-year-old kids who died, and everybody mourned their death by cutting their hairs. But it was also symbolic of saying that if this hair is giving you so much trouble that I have to cover it, let's just then get it off, take it off and just,
a troubling development that I'd love to ask the two of you about is the recent, as of November 6th, 227 Iranian lawmakers have urged the judiciary to prosecute these 14,000 people that are in prison, and the death penalty is not off the table in this instance. And to me, that's horrifying.
That's like a humanitarian crisis.
What are your reactions to that? To me, that just seems, like we're in a period in the U.S. where the death penalty is being debated as even like if we should ever use it, let alone for free speech and demonstrations of protest.
But also a mass amount of people.
Right.
Like that is a huge number.
To even open the door to that. And to
that's
my knowledge,
genocide.
One of the people, I don't know that they actually did anything violent, and yet earned the death penalty.
These are the representatives who have to defend their constituency.
Do they have enough support? Like, or are they just expecting to be voted out?
I mean, presumably we have the institution, I mean, the democratic institutions of, the parliament, the majlis, the judiciary, the presidency. But for all these institutions, there are all these intervening non-constitutional institutions that are not in the Constitution, or maybe later on they were added to the Constitution. There's the Guardian Council. Mm-hmm. The Guardian Council decide who qualifies to be a representative, who doesn't. So these guys that have been qualified, presumably, are the ones that are selected by a select body, which is very exclusivist, right?
So you can vote, but your vote is between a few people that are approved by this council.
And few people voted particularly for these representatives. The president.
Why would you when it's rigged?
Why would you? Exactly. I mean, in the previous cycle of the election, some women tried to recruit a lot of women, from various civil societies, and push them to get elected, to have more female representative in the parliament. But many of them got disqualified. Nonetheless, 18 of them got elected, which is a pretty good number.
I have to say, I am really, really worried. It is gonna get worse because Iranian regime's survival depends on this. Their legitimacy depends on this. So they are not going to let go. They cannot. So they are going to get more violent. You already see the signs of it. And they are already calling, look, French intelligence is involved. Israelis and Americans are involved. This is actually Kurds with ISIS working. We need to stop. Azeris are separatists and they are involved. So it is our country's survival. They are all traitors. And what those protesters are doing is war against God. So we need to defend God. So they are going to keep using those language, and then they are going to attack. I don't see them giving any concessions again because it is their survival. I have to say, when at the beginning of November, Joe Biden came out and said, we are gonna free Iran. And I'm like, oh my God, how could you say that? Don't you dare. That's the worst thing you can do to protesters. And then he quickly fixed it. Iranians gonna free themselves kind of things. So what can West do? What can international community do? Because it's very important to finding of course, we support them, but the way we support them, Iranian regime will turn those protesters into calling them traitors and working with us. I am also very concerned simply because when you look at the Middle East, these kind of protests happens and people join. Look at Arab Springs and afterwards. So when protests turn into something to a certain extent can succeed when they have organizations, when they have leadership, some structures instead of coming and disappearing. But the problem is, if they have organization, if they have leaders, then the regime will go after them. Actually, the head of the judiciary in Iran said, okay, what are your grievances? Let's talk. At the same time, he was saying, judiciary, don't be nice to these guys if they come into your court. Go after them. So they will show to. So where is this protest gonna go? For me, the only hope is, and we see the signs of within the Iranian regime and elites, and you were talking about those families, and within them, if there is a split and a break, and then maybe something happened, but protest itself and the West cannot shape it, cannot change.
No.
I couldn't agree with Filiz more. I mean, she said it, all that I wanted to say. But just what I wanted to add to that, maybe as an Iranian and having my wishful thinking overwhelming my realistic idea, sentiment, and knowing what is happening in Iran, absolutely the way that Felice said that, I just want to repeat women, life, freedom. I think there is a huge power in that slogan. And I will see that continuing, and that light, that fire that is lit under that whole idea is going to continue. Might just get stifled for a while, and it will, as I agree with Feliz, with what she said, because the very survival of the regime depends on being violent and being, having more and more young people accused of enmity with God, and therefore, deserving the death penalty. But really, I deep down in my heart, I believe on women, life, freedom. I have never, ever seen a movement like this.
Yeah.
Particularly for women. And I don't want to say this is the women's movements right now. I don't want to say this is just for veil, as Felice said in the beginning. It is, all encompassing, and it includes both men and women. But it really is an unusual, unprecedented movement. We've never seen even the suffragette movements, women's movements in other parts of the world, nothing like what's happening in Iran. And for that matter, I think, despite the hardship, I think women, life, freedom.
Let's listen to our young, let's listen our future, and more I hear that gives me hope.
Brooke, women, life, freedom. I think that's
women,
a
life,
great
freedom.
theme for season 3
I'm in
to
it.
lead us through here.
Oh my gosh, I could talk to both of you forever. I'm so jealous, Kelsie, you get to work with this individual, and this is our alumni on our podcast too.
Yeah, four.
Way to kick off season 3.
We could be like SNL and maybe give her a jacket if she comes on for 5. So
yeah, maybe she can roast us after a while.
You're doing fantastic work. I just want to really congratulate you for continuing with this very important project.
Well, thank you.
Pleasantly, so beautifully. So all the power to you.
Really appreciate it. We appreciate it because you're doing the good work too. And that's why we're here. We're just trying to get the word out.
Shahla, it was wonderful to
Wonderful to meet you. I'm going to stay in touch with you, please. I'm going to see if I can.
It's happening.
And women connecting. This is what we love. Thanks, Kelsie.
Thanks, Brooke.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.